Aloha, I'm Janice Ogoshi, and on behalf of the Hawaii Conference Formation Missional Team, I welcome you to the closing workshop for the 2021 Church Leaders event. One of the hallmarks of the United Church of Christ is our covenantal theology. We talk a lot about being in covenant with one another, but do we really understand what that means and its implications for our life together? How does our understanding of covenant guide us in our relationships with one another, especially in the church? So our conference minister, the Reverend Dr. David Popham, is well qualified to address this topic. David came to serve us about a year and a half ago in September 2019, and he's had many years of fruitful ministry with the United Church of Christ, having served as Associate Conference Minister with the Rocky Mountain and Central Atlantic Conferences. So he knows well our covenantal theology and how it can be lived out, and will be leading us in this workshop entitled, Don't Panic, Growing in Covenant. So David, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Janice. I'll get your $50 to you. That was a great introduction. Wherever I go, you got to come with me now. I appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Janice says, this has been a good week, but it's been a long week and a lot of time on Zoom. So thank you for hanging in there for this last workshop as we look at the issues of relationships and covenants and those pieces of how we live life as a community of faith. If you've been with us through this week, earlier Jeffrey Aceto this week began his slide, and Jeffrey was one of the professors in the TEL courses that are going on. And he would begin each class by asking, what's your name, what's your home, and what's your ancestors that you're bringing with you into this time together. And I really appreciate that. So my name, it's David Kintner Popham. In my family, I was named by my father, to the chagrin of my mother, who had another name picked out for me, but I'll let them work that out now that both of them have passed on, and they have Jesus mediate that conversation between the two of them instead of me. My ministerial home is with you all. It's with the Hawaii Conference. As Janice noticed, I've been here almost a year and a half now as your conference minister. Some of you, and to be honest, myself ask from time to time, well, what is a conference minister? What's the purpose of that position? And just a reminder, as a way to kind of broaching that question, a conference is a region within the United Church of Christ where folks gather for common ministry and mission and vision and pulling that work together. So we are the Hawaii Conference. We're the folks of UCC folks gathered up here on the islands. Using legal terminology, the conference minister works with conference leadership to pay attention to fiduciary, strategic, and innovative aspects of our region. To use spiritual terminology, the conference minister works with conference leadership to build the beloved community. So that is what this position is about that I happen to be sitting in at the moment. The two ancestors I bring with me today, I want to raise up because they really impact our discussion today. The first ancestor is not so much a person as it is a discipline of study, and that's cognitive linguistics. And cognitive linguistics tell us these important things that are going to play out in our discussion today. One is reality is abstract. And so the second thing is that we use metaphors or mental conceptualizations, mental pictures to describe the abstract realities. However, these metaphors and mental pictures are not the reality themselves. And that's going to play out in some of our discussions today as I contrast two ways of picturing relationships, a ladder and a loop, and how one I think is a little bit better than another one. The other person I bring with me today is Ernest White. He was a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary while I was there, and I had him in class. He taught church administration and leadership. And he wrote a book called The Art of Human Relations, Recognizing and Building Relationships. And it is his work, particularly around the relationship loop, that his voice is very strong with us today. He did not develop the theory of the relationship loops. Unfortunately, I have not been able to chase down the two people who did, but I do know that they, at the time that it was developed in the late 1970s, that they were employed with Purdue University. So that's where ultimately this second metaphor that we'll look at for relationship comes from. My goal is to be able my goal is for you at the end of our time together to be able to ask critical questions of relationships and find lasting solutions to relational issues. So that's my goal. Typically, when I do a workshop, I would turn around and say, what are your goals for the workshop? Zoom doesn't quite allow that to happen. So I'm asking that you answer those questions within your own mind, and those become some of the questions that you can ask them throughout this workshop. We will take time to pause and ask for questions. So let's go ahead. Next slide, please. Relationships in the church can take on many forms. There's relationships between the pastor and church members. There's relationships between church members, and they multiply from there. So the relationship can be new. Is your church entering into a new relationship with a pastor? Have you recently arrived in a new ministerial setting to you, a new church or something of that nature? So the relationship can be new. Sometimes we've been in a church for a while and we begin to kind of scratch our head and say, there seems to be something in the water. It hasn't surfaced yet, but there's something that sensitive folk are picking up on, and it's kind of ambiguous and we don't know what to do around it. That's a form of relationship. Or, to be honest, a relationship can be very conflictual. It can be the burning fire or the open war within a church. And those are also relationships. And so they're all over the place, and there are many more besides those three, right? All congregations negotiate relationships with their ministers and with their members. No congregation gets around doing that. And typically we do such a good job that we don't even notice that we have negotiated these things. So easily did the initial negotiations go that both members and ministers can become fearful and anxious when relationships reach the point of being untenable. The very word untenable moves us to think of irreconcilable differences and brings before our minds, of course, the societal model of divorce. Within the Christian tradition, however, there is another model for dealing with relationship building and conflict when that happens. And this model is one of covenant and mutual support. Covenant, in its biblically rooted understanding, is joining with another for the sake of growing what is life-giving. Joining with another, joining with a group, a congregation, a faith community, or with friends for growing that which is life-giving, or even joining for the work that you do to make a living. So to grow what is life-giving in a person entails radically valuing the person in a church setting as a child of God. And valuing does not always mean we agree. Rather, valuing means we honor the well-being of the other person. So that's covenant. If you think of all the covenants in the Bible, that's what they are kind of aiming at, that growing of what it's life-giving. And in doing that, we honor the well-being of the other people in the relationship. I'm going to talk about covenant by contrasting two mental pictures of relationships. The latter model, which understands relationships as a ladder that has to be climbed. And the path to successful relationship in this model entails surmounting each rung of the ladder effectively. In contrast to that, we're also going to think of relationship as loops or circles. And the path to successful relationship in this model is to travel the various phases of the loop as the relationship unfolds. One way to mentally conceptualize a relationship is a ladder, and this conceptualization I'm picking up on because it is widespread in US culture. This is almost very deeply unconscious in us, but yet this is how we think about relationships. Carefully, the rungs of the ladder are negotiated in this model. So typically in the context of the church life, right, the minister is deemed good by the smoothness and quickness she or he advances up this ladder. And as you can see here, there are definite rungs or definite phases or steps in this ladder. So we initiate the relationship, we develop that relationship, we perfect that relationship, and then we achieve in the relationship. One adept at finessing the rungs is held in high esteem, and those not adept at finessing these rungs are looked on with some suspicion, correct? Um, and we do this whether or not the people who are good at finessing the rungs actually value others. What we are valuing is the rungs and not the others in the relationship. And notice that the relational goal in this model is for you to achieve what you want out of the relationship. So apparently, we don't even need to ask what others may want out of the relationship. It's just so that I achieve what I want out of the relationship. And this is the problem. The ladder is inherently unstable. Any rocking may cause the ladder to topple. And you can probably guess at which of those rungs the rocking occurs. Perfection. Now that's a heavy expectation, right? Scriptures remind us again and again that humans are not perfected creatures. Rather, we are creatures in the process of becoming more than what we presently are. So when we get to perfection, there's a bit of panic that can set in there because we know we're imperfect and the ladder rocks. Also, once you get to that perfection rung, what's the next rung? Achievement. And we've already seen that this achievement rung is one-sided. So how do we feel in a relationship becomes lopsided, right? More panic sets in, more rocking occurs. And then to kind of keep things stable or this ladder from toppling over, we enter into these bizarre dances that we do in relationships so that sleeping dogs lie, so that other things don't get brought up, so that this person doesn't get angry with us. And in the midst of this dancing, more panic sets in because that takes a lot of energy and attention of us, and more rocking sets in and the ladder sways. And then unfortunately, all of our energy can come to naught and the ladder gets upset and we are left with but one option. And our panic, we terminate the relationship. And the reason why I think that the ladder is such a huge model within the US on an unconscious level is because right now our divorce rate is at about 50%. That's a lot of termination. Our rates of terminating workers in jobs is high as well. Now, presently it's high because of COVID-19 and the need to look at budgets and so forth and so on. But there's a high turnover there as well. And I think that is because we have unconsciously climbed this ladder model over and over and over again. And we assume it is the only way to negotiate relationships. Um, the relationship termination goes by many names, right? Divorce, shacked, fired, broken friendships, just to name a few. but they all mean the same thing. The relationship is over. In church life, termination takes on probably one of three forms. Upset people leave the congregation, they have terminated the relationship. The minister is fired, the congregation terminates the relationship with the minister. Or there is a split in the church. One side of the church terminates the relationship with the other side of the church. In all three scenarios, the termination has taken place. Now that's the latter visualization of relationship. Relationships are the abstract reality. The latter is just one way we can look at it. I want to introduce to you another way of looking at relationships. But before I do, I want to again emphasize cognitive linguistics, that relationships are abstract reality. Ladders and loops are simply different ways to visualize the reality. They are not the reality themselves. And the reason why I say that is because one time I was using this model with other couples who, like Carrie and I, share a mixed orientation marriage. And there was this one guy that just the more I went on, the more fidgeting and agitated he become. And finally, toward the end of the presentation, he exploded and he said, relationships are ladders, not circles. Relationships are reality, abstract reality. Ladders and loops are but visualizations or conceptualizations of the abstract reality. If you are like this one guy and you can only perceive a relationships as carefully climbing a ladder, then I'm going to warn you now, you're going to become very uncomfortable with this rest of this presentation. It doesn't mean you have to change the way you conceptualize reality. I just want to talk about a different way that I think is more biblically grounded. So instead of visualizing ladders to perfection and achievement, I think we are more faithfully grounded in a biblical viewpoint if we think of relationships as loops. For me, the loop symbolizes the biblical notion of what it means to be human, or in the process of becoming more firmly a child of God, or more formally like the image of Christ, or more formally redeemed soul upon the earth, whatever language you use there. With a loop, we gain a sense that humans are not perfected, but are creatures who continue to develop more into the likeness of God, or more into the persons God is calling us to be. When we conceptualize or visualize relationships as a loop, we realize some of the following. Relationships change over time as you process around this loop over time. We craft or we invent ourselves in relationship to others. And what I mean by that, right, our admiration and jealousies, our enmity and goodwill, our dependence and independence and interdependence are a part of the complexity of our journey in becoming who we are. And we become who we are in relationship with those around us, as well as our relationship with God. Stability in the loop, and this is one of the biggest difference between this model and the ladder model. The ladder model, stability relied upon the structure of the ladder. Stability in the loop is provided by the desire of those involved who are creating each other in relationship to each other to their desire for a successful outcome, as opposed to what with the latter, what I alone can achieve because of this relationship. So that to me is the more biblical grounding of the loop model. So a relationship begins with joining. All right, you could have figured that out. I could have figured that out. But thank goodness people made hundreds of thousands of dollars writing books, figured it out for us. But we begin with joining a person or an entity. I'm going to use both the romantic model, so between two people falling in love, as well as a model of a minister joining with a congregation. Usually when we join with others, we do so in order to pursue a common achievement or a common enrichment. In a work relationship, we do so because we're achieving common work together. It is not then uncommon to join others because the relationship helps us to pursue outcomes and purposes we value. For example, why did you join the congregation you are a member of? Unless you're a minister, you joined them because they hired you in. But why did you as a layperson join that church? Normally, you did it because you share similar values and visions of those who also are members of that faith community. There is at least a general sense of shared spiritual outlooks, right? So we've joined them for those common goals. In the loop model, what we're doing at this phase of joining is that we are working out the expectations of our relationship. So the primary task of joining is clarifying and raising up into consciousness our expectations. In romantic relationship, this is the dating phase. In congregations, this is the search phase for a new minister. And we are testing the relationship for its potential wealth and its potential debits. In short, we are collectively establishing our assumptions for the relationship by consciously raising up and clarifying those expectations. That's the primary task of the joining phase. There is a secondary task. And those of you who attended the church leaders event last year and you attended my workshop on joining, you've heard this before. I'm going to quickly look at this again for those who might not have heard this last year. But the second thing we do when joining, we raise up the expectations. That's the primary task. The secondary task is to ask the question, where are we joining at in this relationship? And those of you who are familiar with Eric Byrne and transactional analysis will recognize his language at. There are 4 places to join at. We can join at, I'm okay, but you are not okay. And as I've been in this conference now for a year and a half, there are 4 entities within the conference that I join with, and I'm not okay with those entities. Actually, I'm okay. The position I'm in, conference minister, is not okay. And it's kind of difficult attending those meetings, right? Because no matter what I say, no matter what I do, I'm not okay. And you get tired of being beaten up on from time to time. So that's one of the joinings. Another joining is that I'm not okay and you're not okay. And you have to realize that in churches, that's a common place for us to join, right? Because we know we're not okay. We know we are sinners saved by a loving and gracious God. And how wonderful it is that we could come and we could talk about not being okay and have that held in some spiritual, wonderful pieces so that we work on these things together. The problem is that if we stay there, we never help anybody get beyond not being okay. So that's a weak point of joining as well. We can also join at a place where I'm okay, but you're not okay. And at that point, or I'm sorry, that should say you're okay, but I'm not okay. Sorry, I didn't capture that on my slide correctly. And that is the point where I feel like I don't measure up. People with low self-esteem often dwell in this point of joining. I don't measure up and I need what you have to make me measure up. But because I don't feel good about myself, I'm going to kind of steal that from you. And in stealing that from you, I still don't feel good about myself. So that's a weak point of joining as well. The best place of joining is that I'm okay, you're okay. Here we care for one another, not because some are needy or we are all needy or something of that nature. We care because we recognize the unique worth and dignity within each other. And we compassionately discover what is good, and we join the good to create the foundation of a successful relationship. So this is the joining phase. We work all of this out in the joining phase. We live some of it out later on. We'll look at that down the road. But here at this point of the loop, we are joining. So we are asking the primary task, what's our expectations about this relationship? What's our unspoken assumptions about the relationships? And then we are also looking at how are we joining together, and is that a healthy place to join at? So we have joined together, and now we have journeyed around this loop to the point of commitment. We liked what we have labeled in that joining. We liked what we have joined in that joining, and now we're solidifying it. If this was a romantic relationship, the organ would be blaring the wedding march, and we'd be walking down the aisle, solidifying our commitments. For congregations, this is the call vote of the minister to a congregation. That is the commitment phase here. We cement the relationship by making permanent those expectations and assumptions worked out during the joining phase of this loop. So we're now going to say, yes, we commit to these things. We're so good at this that we even write up within our churches call agreements that list out those expectations, right? Wonderful. We should be doing those things. If we're at a wedding, we're hearing vows being said. The thing to note here is that shallow commitments results in loose or weak connections. Almost anything will pull the relationship apart. A business or an office that has high turnover has high shallow commitments, and that's why they have lots of turnover. Strong commitments allow for flexibility and room for the unknown. This is the important thing, for the unknown and the unexpected, and most importantly, the continuing development of personalities and relationship to one another. That's what makes that relationship strong. It allows for that room and that flexibility for people to change over time. We are now in this committed relationship. We continue because people continue to grow. We continue to move around the loop. We are in what is known as the productivity time. Both in the romantic relationship and in church life, we call this the honeymoon. Woo! We love honeymoons, right? We are living into the conscious assumptions worked out during the time of joining that we have committed ourselves to. We are comfortable with the relationship. The desired results are being produced. Conflicts are minimum. Communications are healthy and easy. Everyone is committed in serving this relationship. We are productive together, and we are all enjoying the fruits of that productivity together. We feel great about each other. Nothing good lasts forever because humans are imperfect creatures striving for more. And sometimes even in that striving, imperfect things happen. Usually the end of the productivity phase, notice how we travel around this loop, is signaled by the appearance of a pinch. The pinch is that feelings of, this is not quite what I expected. That's the pinch. And no matter how wonderful the relationship is, pinches always occur because that's part of being human. The productivity phase ends when a person uses as much energy tolerating the pinch as maintaining the relationship. Pinches are often the results of hidden, unconscious, secret assumptions never before expressed in the relationship. So what do I mean by that? In joining, remember, we worked out everything. We talked it through. We talked. We wrote, and we agreed with stuff and we signed it. If we're working for a business, if we're working in the church, we've committed to it going into a marital relationship. So where did these other things come from? Well, the human mind is split between those things we are conscious of and we are aware of, and those things that are hidden from us and are unconscious. And we're not aware of them, and we don't become aware of them until things begin to take place that raise those feelings and ideas up into our consciousness. As I said, it begins with a at first, and then it becomes an oh, what's going on here? So much energy is given into those explicit things we put into the relationship, what is assumed of each person involved and what the rewards of meeting those assumptions are. We commit ourselves to the relationship moving forward and our ability to meet the conscious and negotiated assumptions. As I've said, we write these down, then we move around, we get to this pinch, and hidden and unconscious assumptions begin to rise up. And they're hidden and unconscious because we don't know we have them. So hidden assumptions usually arise when persons feel something foundational within them is being violated. Hidden assumptions arise when we feel something foundational within us is being violated. At the core of who we are lies what? Lies our character, lies our ethics, lies our sense of distinctiveness, what makes us us and unique within all the 10 billion people living on the face of the planet. So in short, our values, our identity, our purpose that drive us, they lie at the hub of who we are. It is these intangible foundational assumptions and expectations by which we live our lives. And when these assumptions go unmet, even if we don't even know we're there, when they go unmet or they become violated, we feel the pinch of the relationship. So such remarks, particularly in personal relationships, right? Such remarks as, I didn't know you felt that way, or I thought I knew you better, make us aware that we are dealing with unexpressed foundational assumptions. By the way, congregations also have foundational assumptions by which they live out their mission in the world. In organizational language, this is called the internal hub around which the group centers themselves. So hidden assumption and expectations tend to be strongly connected within the church to this hub. And one of the reasons congregational assumptions are hidden is that we often assume everyone shares the same outlooks since we are all tied to the same congregational hub. That should not be an assumption by anybody within a congregation. The pinch, by the way, can be lived with for a long time. However, persons can only compromise their foundational assumptions for so long, and ultimately, the need to reclaim and assert the foundational assumption will lead to disruption. Any questions around the pinch, hidden assumptions, or hub centers? So, as the pinch develops, we move around the loop. We're now about two-thirds of the way around the loop here. We move around the loop to where something must be done. The relationship at its presently is can no longer be sustained. And we are at the creative and can be healthy phase of disruption. Now, disruptions are natural occurrences. We can't fold them off, people. They're going to happen because pinches happen. So they're natural occurrences within an interpersonal relationship. just as swells or natural occurrences in the ocean. So how we handle this not, the question is not really disruption up here. The question is, how will we handle this disruption? And the power to handle this disruption is totally within our grasp, either as a community or as individual people. According to the latter model of relationships, this is the point of the perfection run, right? And this is where things become very shaky. Uh, Here, we can look at different choices to make. In the life of the congregation, by the way, this is the time when voices begin to be raised around the continuing employment of the pastor or the continuing leadership of a particular lay person. Disruption offers four options for us. One of them is termination. One of them is continuing eruption. One of them is recommitment, and we need to look at that one. And one of them is renegotiation. So there are three easy answers and one tough answer. And I know that's not how this slide is developed. This is some stuff I did after the slides were sent over to be uh, uh, um, lodged in the correct places and not with me. So so let's look at three easy answers. And it doesn't mean the easy answers are not the correct answers. It just means that covenantally speaking, the answer we want to get to is the more arduous of the ways of working through a relationship. So the most appealing and the most popular response to disruption in US society is termination, because we have not learned how to get along with each other. We learn to step away from relationships. In the latter model, this is the standard response. And again, I believe the latter model is the most probably unconscious conceptualization we have within the United States. This option is favored by persons with a low level of tolerance in conflict. It's the go-to answer, and that is why. I was working with a colleague one time who I highly admired. I still admire him, although he's now retired from active ministry. And he came to me asking for help with a council member who just pushed all of his buttons in all the wrong ways. And I learned in some training that in order to resource a person who doesn't feel like they know what to do around things, you ask them, have you dealt with this before? And the goal is you find out how they dealt with it before, and that becomes the resource from which they can then deal with the issue again. And he named no less than 4 times he had dealt with people like this before, and in all 4 situations, he had resigned his position and went somewhere else, which didn't leave me much hope to get him somewhere else to resource him. As it was in this case, God intervened, and the council member had, due to some family issues, had to resign from the council, and so the person was able not to have to move away from that particular thing. But it just shows to go how easy it is. Termination is the first option we often turn to. By way, organizations and churches that use terminations as their first options tend to experience those high levels of turnover. Why? Because relationships are always ended and are always in danger of being ended, and therefore the relationship remains weak. Why put my energy and time into this if I'm just going to be fired anyway? So if you're in an office with high termination, this is one of the things that are at work there. The key discernment, and I'm not saying termination should never be used. The key discernment here is this relationship dead? If either party in a relationship has no desire or hope for continuing and reconstructing the relationship beyond the pinch, then both should bless each other and part each other with dignity. And often within church work, we come across that where either the church or or the minister, and sometimes both, has said we need to separate with dignity, and we can help you do that. The next option is continuing eruption. It's called the volcano syndrome. And this is where uh, uh, it lives out in family and organizational systems which thrive on emotional crisis. So blowups and eruptions are continuous, promoting a perpetual state of uproar. These eruptions can be a source of power for those who want others to cringe before them. It becomes very disingenuous when it is the boss that is the one in the continuous uproar. And part of the reasons we do that is because we substitute that emotional uproar for a positive, genuine intimacy. We haven't been able to figure out how to do that on our own. Persons accustomed then to living in conflicted families will often create the same atmosphere in the church family because we're dealing with family systems there, and that just travels over with them. The eruptions are a way of testing the relationship to see if others care or how far a person can actually push the relationship. Eruptions have very little to do with the persons in the relationships and more to do with the one who blows up and a way of getting attention or manipulating other people. Eruptions also take the focus right off the pinch, off the primary concern, off whatever that assumption is that needs to be addressed, and places the focus on personality and other secondary concerns. The key discernment in this situation is what is the truth behind the eruption? What is the truth behind the eruption? Often blowups contain a kernel of reality, address the reality if warranted, yet also help the person understand that an overreaction has taken place in an eruption. The third option is recommitment. And for people of faith, this is a very tempting option. And I'm going to ask you to resist it. And here's why. To recommit simply means that we're going to go back and we're going to go and we're going to try harder without changing anything. What we are recommitting to is that initial set of expectations worked out and committed to. And so recommitment calls upon persons to keep the relationship the way it has been. Recommitment is a ladder issue, not a loop issue, a ladder issue. Keep the relationship the way it has been. We don't change, and therefore the relationship doesn't change. It asks people to continue to compromise their foundational assumptions for the sake of the relationship. It demands that persons keep suppressing their negative feelings while increasing their determination to make it work. By the way, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this is what he means by cheap grace. It is forgiveness without accountability and change. Says Dr. White in his book, this option has one outstanding feature. Persons will invariably move from the commitment stage back to the disruption stage in one half the time it took the first time. Why? Because the persons involved have already experienced the unworkable expectations they hold. When unmet expectations reappear, discouragement and disgruntledness sets in even more quickly. The key discernment here is this the kiss and makeup approach? When there is no fundamental change around the pinch, the hidden assumptions remain unfulfilled and they remained creating the feelings of unmet expectations. The three preceding options are exercised from the point, by the way, of overcoming objections, right? We're overcoming an objection simply by terminating the relationship. We're overcoming the objection simply by being in continually eruption and never addressing that objection. We're overcoming the objection by ignoring it and committing ourselves to each other anyway. So they are our point of view of overcoming the objection instead of seeking to satisfy the unconscious assumption and expectations. That gets us to the next slide. And yes, I know it's on this slide too, but let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And what is the covenantal way of working through a disruption? While renegotiation, this idea that we are now renegotiating these conscious expectations, while it offers the most fruitful option when disruption occurs, it is also the most difficult. And here again, I'm quoting Dr. White. In renegotiation, parties in the relationships agree to reconstruct their relationship. They practically start over, except they now have experience in the relationship. Both parties examine and express these new expectations. So this is why this phase is difficult. It can be uncomfortable because we're reconstructing this relationship. And part of reconstructing the relationship is asking that question, what part do I have in this relationship? Do I have a part in this relationship? So persons at this point in the loop, persons surface and negotiate what has been the hidden, unconscious, and unexpected assumptions which led to the pinch, right? We know it's there because the pinch raised it up. And persons come to understand and honor the values which all parties bring into the relationship. At this point, the parties involved must say and hear from each other, we are not the same as when this relationship began. We are different persons and need a different relationship. And that can be very uncomfortable for some people because it means we're inviting in the unknown and the undetermined at this time in order to kind of figure that out. The key discernment here is honesty. Is everyone involved speaking their truth to the impasse? When radically valuing another, we find the energy and the inclination to renegotiate and rejoin with them as opposed to jettisoning the relationship. When our focus is placed on our foundational assumptions instead of personalities, we can move from conflict management to growing in covenant with one another. So I'm going to pause here for any questions about the four options for resolving a disruption.
I have a question. Right, it's Barry here. What about that a congregation is not, on a homogeneous one sort of one way that you can't describe a congregation as a whole with characteristics and qualities, then which makes it even talk about difficult, but even like hundreds of times more difficult.
It does. When you have a congregation in itself that is not solidified about identity or that internal hub is fluid, then you really need to be involved in those conversations around the values and the purpose of a conversation, of a congregation, and helping people buy into those values and that purpose. That will help solidify that identity. Part of the conflict in a congregation that's fluid like that is simply conflict around whose values is being prioritized over who. And so one of the ways you address that conflict is to go back to purpose and talk about what's our purpose, and then out of there, what are the values that we are going to live out of.
Thank you, that's great, appreciate it.
Aloha, David. This is Jeff Glass. I'm the new interim pastor at Hokuloa Church.
Aloha.
And I always appreciate training in conflict management. The course I took in seminary was the most helpful, inspirational course of my 4 years in seminary to get my MDiv many years ago. I don't know if others have this sense, but for me, the word recommitment carries a little different meaning than what you shared in your presentation. I appreciate how you defined it and how it works in this conflict management cycle that you've been sharing with us. But in my mind, recommitment means I'm going to start again to try and make things better than what they were before. And as a pastor, we often challenge the congregation to recommit themselves via sermons or via small group meetings or even one-on-one visitation. So I don't know if anyone else has my idea of recommitment in mind, but I just wanted to share that reflection with you. Thank you.
That's fine. It's the problem with language, right? How one person nuances a word will be different from how another person nuances a word. So thank you for that, Jeff. We got a little more to discuss. Normally, when I first started working with this model of relationship building and of how a relationship can grow and people can change and yet maintain that relationship, this is where I ended. Largely because this is where Dr. White books ended, but also because I just assume people knew how to do that renegotiation piece. After all, they've been in relationship with each other and they don't need me sticking my nose in their business. However, having done this now on several occasions, I've learned that we need a bit more information on how to clarify our hidden assumptions while remaining faithful to the covenant we have made with each other. So with that, Lori, if you'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. The information on this slide, and I forgot to announce that, comes from Carrie Patterson and some other folks who's written a couple of books. One's called Crucial Conversations, and there's another one called it's not more crucial conversations, but it's some follow-up, and it's got that part of it in the title as well. Those books are well worth seeking out and getting. They're somewhat expensive, but the information in them is really wonderful information. According to Patterson, a useful metaphor for our hub of assumptions, what I'm calling a hub of assumptions, he calls a pool of meaning. And each person has their own pool of meaning that's based on what? Their outlooks, their ideas, their experiences, their thoughts, their points of view, their identity, their admirations, their enmity, all of that makes up our pool of meaning. The unique combination of these things makes up, as I said, your personal pool of that. And that's why my pool of meaning is going to differ from Lori's, who differs from Julie, who differs from Janice, who differs from Barry, who differs from everybody else. So the first step in determining what you really want in a renegotiation, right, is to figure out what your pool of meaning is. This is not a selfie step. This is discernment of who you are and what it is that you feel God is calling for you out of life. So you are seeking to enlarge that pool of meaning. Answering these questions help us to do that. And they're simple questions, right? What do I really want for myself? And you can ask that question even more pertinently. What do I really want for myself out of this relationship? What do I really want for others? What do I really want for the relationship itself? Once you'd answer those, then you answer the grand question, how would I behave if I really wanted these results? And not to rub a point too much, but for me, that's the difference between recommitment and renegotiation. And recommitment, I'm just agreeing mentally to some things, but my behavior hasn't changed. And in this model, that's how recommitment is understood. I understand as Jeff has pointed out, understand it differently. Renegotiation means I'm going to change my behavior because we have decided we're not the same people and we need to change, which means my behavior needs to change as well. The answer to this final question allows you to articulate your foundational assumptions and the behavior you expect connected with them. I had a friend one time who had an adult child um, um, working in the insurance business. So if David Takagi is on here, I know this does not represent your office, but the friend, his adult child worked in the insurance business, and he was new to the insurance business. This is his first month working in the office. When the office supervisor came through and said to everybody, all the claims that came in today, dump into your trash can. So we could turn around and tell our people, we haven't received your claims. My friend's son quit that day because that was a huge disruption of his personal values and why he went into that part of insurance, to be helpful to people in the use of their insurance that they had paid for. So we know these disruptions happens, we know these things take place, and clarifying with these questions, what do I really want? What do I want for myself? What do I want for others? What do I want for the relationship? How would my behavior change if I was to commit myself to these things? Helps us to commit ourselves, or to that's our compass, or that's our anchor. Take whichever picture you want, that gets us through these nebulous things, relationships that we have to negotiate from time to time. So clarifying these assumptions we have is what really helps us to be faithful to this covenant that we are processing around, so that the covenant remains even as the relationships change. Another way of remaining faithful to covenant is to refuse to proffer or participate in what's called the sucker's choice, which means sometimes in order to justify our behavior, we put out there, we're between a rock and a hard place. That's the sucker's choice. It's a lose-lose, so choose whichever lose you think is less losing, right? That's the sucker choice. There's only one response, and the response is something that compromises that foundational assumptions that guide your life. So you don't want to do that. There's always, as we've seen, there's always other ways of dealing with things, as long as you remain faithful to the covenant and processing through the covenant. A third way of remaining faithful to covenant is to be open to change yourself. Listening to be understood, excuse me, that's talking to be understood. Listening to understand will increase your pool of meaning. It enriches your knowledge of the other person, and it alters your viewpoint. And when your viewpoint gets altered, your behavior becomes offered. If you are not open to these possibilities, you're not really engaged in listening to understand, right? You're listening to react, or you're listening to debate to make your point and make it stronger than the person made their point, and your behavior doesn't change, it becomes entrenched. So listening to understand, that helps us change our behavior. And finally, there are circumstances where we ponder about the best time, particularly in church life, where we ponder about the best time to bring in a mediator to help facilitate these kind of high-stake renegotiations or recommitments. Um, Unfortunately, there's no fast rule around when to do that. There's only careful and sensitive discernment as mediation asks things of both parties on other sides of the pinch. And typically, if you're at that point, you're either talking with your committee on ministry for your association, or more likely you're talking to somebody within the conference office, an associate conference minister or myself, once we get to that point of rub and friction. So to help discern when mediation is warranted, I find it helpful to think in terms of a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being low issues and 5 being we're burning in the fire type of thing. So where does the conflict then rate on the scale in terms of 1 to 5? Is it a 1 or a 2? That's a low-level issue. It can be handled within the congregation. Emotions around it are pretty tame. People are still pretty rational. They're acting out of their rational brain and they're not acting out of emotions. They're listening to understand and not listening to debate. There are, then we can move up to a 3. Here, things become a little more moderate, a little more intense. There's a little more passion around them. People are becoming a little more anxious as to how this will turn out. And often this is a time when church leadership begins to say, we need to address this issue. Right now, it's not just individuals talking, the church is beginning to talk about the issue. At this time, the church can probably still handle these issues within the church, although they may reach out for advice from people from outside of the congregation. And then finally, if things progress to a 4 or a 5, here the disruption really is beginning to become weary and weigh on the congregation. People are entrenched. Seems no way of bridging whatever the gap between the two groups is. And so we appeal to outside mediation. Asking for mediation, this is important to remember. And I forgot this actually back in the summer, and I should have realized this as well, because I think it led to some discomfort that we could have overlooked. But anyway, asking for mediation is never a neutral act. Those seeking mediation need to understand, or those seeking mediation, they understand it as a step towards some type of resolution, right? Those not asking for mediation, they understand it as triangulation and will often then prove even more less likely to talk and renegotiate than before. So both parties, or all parties if it's multiple parties, have to agree to mediation before it is sought. Otherwise, mediation is dead before arrival. And that was the mistake I made this summer with the congregation as we moved toward mediation. I did not make sure we had the buy-in of those on the other side of that particular issue, and it did slow mediation down. Growing in covenant and cooperation is an adventure. And it's an adventure of the soul, because in the midst of all of this, there's the Holy Spirit, there is the peace of Christ, and there is the creativity of God flowing in among us, and as we grow to be more of what God has called us to be. Radically valuing one another and creating loving communities of faith, that's what covenant is about. Pinches and disruptions are bound to happen. That's what humanness is being about. So while these times carry some anxiety, you now know that they can also be points of God's wild and glorious grace, which beckons us ever deeper into the mysteries of relationships with one another. And with that, I conclude my presentation and open it up again if there are questions that people may have.
Aloha kahu. This is Linda Iwamoto from Kapa'a First Hawaiian Church on Kauai. We have a family that actually the church has lost members because of one particular family. And I'm not sure if anyone has approached them, but I think it's sad that we as a church has to go through this kind of problem, and But they do know what they're doing, but they continue to do it. And so I'm not sure. For me, I would say we need help. How do
I hear
we,
what you're saying there.
yeah, so how do we approach the situation with them? Because it continues and it makes the congregation, especially the old timers, well, both old and new, the situation that goes on. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yes.
Kamala.
And we had the, thank you, Linda, for that question. And your congregation has a particular nuance to it in that it is lay-led and there's not a minister there who would often help guide these type of conversations going on. So I want to acknowledge that and honor that as well, which is my way of saying my answer to you may not necessarily apply across the board to other congregations. In this case, I would advise that the leadership of the church would need to come together and decide within themselves how best to approach the family that is of concern, what they want to say to that family, right? What are our assumptions that we feel are being disrupted that we want to just lay before the family because they may or may not acknowledge that, and then engaged in the family with those assumptions. The harder part here to play, that's the easy part. The harder part is to also be the active listener as you hear back from the family to help discern what it is that is driving their behavior as well. But that's the place to start. And it could be that you would do this over, instead of trying to do this all in one conversation, you might do it over a couple of conversations. So at first you come together and you kind of lay out, here's our concerns, and you hear the people, the family talk, then the leadership can get back together and say, well, what did we hear the family saying as they talked? And then reapproach the family about what they heard then. And then develops from there. You always have, Linda, available to you access to the conference office here, to me or to Dorothy, our associate conference minister, as well as ministers on your island that you have relationship to. Feel free to ask as well with them. And it could be, if mediation is needed, we could use one of the ministers on Kauai to help with that mediation.
Okay, mahalo.
Thank you. Are there other burning questions? I'm also good for angry denunciations because, as I would remind you, as the cognitive linguistics will remind us, we're just talking about a concrete way dealing with an abstract reality, and there are more than one concrete ways out there. If there are no more questions at this time, feel free to know that I'm always here to be in conversation with you, either about this or other subject or things going on in your congregation. That's why this office exists, is to support your congregations and your lay ministers or lay members and your authorized ministers. And so please know that's why we're here. If there's nothing further, we will conclude then this workshop. We do have a concluding little worshiping piece. We're going to go back in a earlier incarnation of my ministry. I worked with overseeing camps and retreats, and one of those retreats was confirmation retreat. And in that retreat, we help people to talk about how they image God, whether that was a happy God or a sad God, an angry God or a blessing God, all these ways that we have, that we imagine God. We had an exercise we called Crazy Gods Make for Crazy People. And it was fun to hear all the different ways youth thought God was crazy. And then we unpacked that and talked about that during our retreat. inevitably, I can't even say that today, they would say to me or ask me, David, what is your image of God? And my image of God is of this deity that has fallen utterly head over heels in love with creation and takes wild abandonment, joy in the diversity of creation. And so this piece we're going to see celebrates that God in our lives. And I hope it celebrates that God with you as well. Following what we'll see, it's about a 5-minute video piece. Then I'll follow that up with a benediction and we'll be officially done.
The heavens rejoice. The heavens rejoice.
Hear now this blessing upon our time together and upon our parting from this time together. The joy of God to you, the deep joy of fish in the coral, the light joy of birds among the air, the laughing joy of children squealing with delight, the ancient joy of our God head over heels in love with creation, the joy of God to you. And now go forth and share this joy with your neighbors. Amen.